The first which naturally claims our attention is the religion of ancient Egypt, but I can show only the main features and characteristics of this form of paganism, avoiding the complications of their system and their perplexing names as much as possible. I wish to present what is ascertained and intelligible rather than what is ingenious and obscure. The religion of Egypt is very old. How old we cannot tell with certainty. We know that it existed before Abraham and with but few changes for at least 2,000 years. Mariette places the era of the first Egyptian dynasty under Menes at 5004 BC. It is supposed that the earliest form of the Egyptian religion was monotheistic, such as was known later, however, only to a few of the higher priesthood. What the esoteric wisdom really was, we can only conjecture, since there are no sacred books or writings that have come down to us like the Indian Vedas and the Persian Avesta. Herodotus affirms that he knew the mysteries, but he did not reveal them. But monotheism was lost sight of in Egypt at an earlier period than the beginning of authentic history. It is the fate of all institutions to become corrupt, and this is particularly true of religious systems. The reason of this is not difficult to explain. The Bible and human experience fully exhibit the course of this degradation. Hence, before Abraham's visit to Egypt, the religion of that land had degenerated into a gross and complicated polytheism, which it was apparently for the interest of the priesthood to perpetuate. The Egyptian religion was the worship of the powers of nature. The sun, the moon, the planets, the air, the storm, light, fire, the clouds, the rivers, the lightning, all of which were supposed to exercise a mysterious influence over human destiny. There was doubtless an indefinite sense of awe in view of the wonders of the material universe, extending to a vague fear of some almighty supremacy over all that could be seen or known. To these powers of nature the Egyptians gave names and made them divinities. The Egyptian polytheism was complex and even contradictory. What it lost in logical sequence, it gained in variety. Wilkinson enumerates 73 principal divinities, and Birch 63. But there were some hundreds of lesser gods, discharging peculiar functions and presiding over different localities. Every town had its guardian deity to whom prayers or sacrifices were offered by the priests. The more complicated the religious rites, the more firmly cemented was the power of the priestly caste, and the more indispensable were priestly services for the offerings and propitiations. Of these Egyptian deities, there were 8 of the first rank, but the list of them differs according to different writers, since in the great cities different deities were worshipped. There were Ammon, the concealed god, the sovereign over all, corresponding to the Jupiter of the Romans, whose sacred city was Thebes. At a later date, this god was identified with Ammon-Ra, the physical sun. Ra was the sun god, especially worshipped at Heliopolis, the symbol of light and heat. Kneph was the spirit of God moving over the face of the waters, whose principal seat of worship was in Upper Egypt. Ptah was a sort of artisan god who made the sun, moon, and the earth, the father of beginnings. His sign was the Scarabaeus, or beetle, and his patron city was Memphis. Kem was the generative principle presiding over the vegetable world, the giver of fertility and the lord of the harvest. These deities are supposed to have represented spirit passing into matter and form, a process of divine incarnation. But the most popular deity was Osiris. His image is found standing on the oldest monument, a form of Ra, the light of the lower world and king and judge of Hades. His worship was universal throughout Egypt, but his chief temples were at Abydos and Philae. He was regarded as mild, beneficent, and good. In opposition to him were Set, malignant and evil, and Bes, the god of death. Isis, the wife and sister of Osiris. The wife and sister of Osiris was a sort of sun goddess representing the productive power of nature. Khons was the moon god. Maut, the consort of Amun, represented nature. Sati, the wife of Kneph, bore a resemblance to Juno. Nut was the goddess of the firmament. Ma was the goddess of truth. Horus was the mediator between creation and destruction. But in spite of the multiplicity of deities, the Egyptian worship centered in some form upon heat or fire. Generally the sun, the most powerful and brilliant of the forces of nature. Among all the ancient pagan nations, the sun, the moon, and the planets, under different names, whether impersonated or not, were the principal objects of worship for the people. To these temples were erected statues raised and sacrifices made. No ancient nation was more devout or more constant to the service of its gods than were the Egyptians, and hence being superstitious, they were preeminently under the control of priests. And hence, being superstitious, they were preeminently under the control of priests. As the people were in India, we see chiefly in India and Egypt the power of caste, tyrannical, exclusive, and pretentious, and powerful in proportion to the belief in a future state. Take away the belief in future existence and future rewards and punishments, and there is not much religion left. There may be philosophy and morality, but no religion which is based on the fear and love of God and the destiny of the soul after death. Saint Augustine, in his City of God, his greatest work, ridicules all the gods who are not able to save the soul, and all religions where future existence is not recognized as the most important thing which can occupy the mind of man. We cannot then utterly despise the religion of Egypt in spite of the absurdities mingled with it, the multiplicity of gods, and the doctrine of metempsychosis, since it included a distinct recognition of a future state of rewards and punishments according to the deeds done in the body. On this belief rested the power of the priests who were supposed to intercede with the deities and who alone were appointed to offer them sacrifices in order to gain their favor or deprecate their wrath. The idea of death and judgment was ever present to the thoughts of the Egyptians, from the highest to the lowest, and must have modified their conduct, stimulating them to virtue and restraining them from vice. For virtue and vice are not revelations, they are instincts implanted in the soul. No ancient teacher enjoined the duties based on an immutable morality with more force than Confucius, Buddha, and Epictetus. Who in any land or age has ignored the duties of filial obedience, respect to rulers, kindness to the miserable, protection to the weak, honesty, benevolence, sincerity, and truthfulness, with the discharge of these duties written on the heart, have been associated the favor of the gods and happiness in the future world, whatever errors may have crept into theological dogmas and speculations. Believing then in a future state where sin would be punished and virtue rewarded, and believing in it firmly and piously, the ancient Egyptians were a peaceful and comparatively moral people. All writers admit their industry, their simplicity of life, their respect for law, their loyalty to priests and rulers, hence there was permanence to their institutions. For rapine, violence, and revolution were rare. They were not warlike, although often engaged in war by the command of ambitious kings. Generally, the policy of their government was conservative and pacific. Military ambition and thirst for foreign conquest were not the peculiar sins of Egyptian kings. They sought rather to develop national industries and resources. The occupation of the people was in agriculture and the useful arts, which last they carried to considerable perfection, especially in the working of metals, textile fabrics, and ornamental jewelry. Their grand monuments were not triumphal arches, but temples and mausoleums. Even the pyramids may have been built to preserve the bodies of kings until the soul should be acquitted or condemned, and therefore more religious in their uses than as mere emblems of pride and power. And when monuments were erected to perpetuate the fame of princes, their supreme design was to receive the engraven memorials of the virtuous deeds of the kings as fathers of the people. The priests, whose business it was to perform religious rites and ceremonies to the various gods of the Egyptians, were extremely numerous. They held the highest social rank and were exempt from taxes. They were clothed in white linen, which was kept scrupulously clean. They washed their whole bodies twice a day. They shaved the head and wore no beard. They practiced circumcision, which rite was of extreme antiquity, existing in Egypt 2,400 years before Christ and at least 400 years before Abraham, and has been found among primitive peoples all over the world. They did not make a show of sanctity, nor were they ascetic like the Brahmins. They were married and were allowed to drink wine and to eat meat, but not fish nor beans, which disturbed digestion. The son of a priest was generally a priest also. There were grades of rank among the priesthood, but not more so than in the Roman Catholic Church. The high priest was a great dignitary and generally belonged to the royal family. The king himself was a priest. The Egyptian ritual of worship was the most complicated of all rituals, and their literature and philosophy were only branches of theology. Religious observances, says Freeman Clarke, were so numerous and so imperative that the most common labors of daily life could not be performed without a perpetual reference to some priestly regulation. There were more religious festivals than among any other ancient nation. The land was covered with temples, and every temple consecrated to a single divinity, to whom some animal was sacred, supported a large body of priests. The authorities on Egyptian history, especially Wilkinson, speak highly, on the whole, of the morals of the priesthood and of their arduous and gloomy life of superintending ceremonies, sacrifices, professions, and funerals. Their life was so full of minute duties and restrictions that they rarely appeared in public, and their aspect as well as influence was austere and sacerdotal. One of the most distinctive features of the Egyptian religion was the idea of the transmigration of souls, that when men die, their souls reappear on earth in various animals in expiation of their sins. Osiris was the god before whose tribunal all departed spirits appeared to be judged. If evil preponderated in their lives, their souls passed into a long series of animals until their sins were expiated. When the purified souls, after thousands of years, perhaps passed into their old bodies. Hence it was the great object of the Egyptians to prefer their mortal bodies after death, and thus arose the custom of embalming them. It is difficult to compute the number of mummies that have been found in Egypt. If a man was wealthy, it cost his family as much as $1,000 to embalm his body suitably to his rank. The embalmed bodies of kings were preserved in marble sarcophagi and hidden in gigantic monuments. The most repulsive thing in the Egyptian religion was animal worship. To each deity some animal was sacred. Thus Apis, the sacred bull of Memphis, was the representative of Osiris. The cow was sacred to Isis and to Hathor, her mother. Sheep were sacred to Kneph, as well as the asp. Hawks were sacred to Ra. Lions were emblems of Horus. Wolves of Anubis. Hippopotami of Set. Each town was jealous of the honor of its special favorites among the gods. gods. The worst form of this animal worship, says Rawlinson, was the belief that a deity absolutely became incarnate in an individual animal and so remained until the animal's death. Such were the Apis bulls, of which a succession was maintained at Memphis in the temple of Ptah, or according to others of Osiris. These beasts, maintained at the cost of the priestly communities in the great temples of their respective cities, were perpetually adored and prayed to by thousands during their lives, and at their deaths were entombed with the utmost care in huge sarcophagi. While all Egypt went into mourning on their decease. Such was the religion of Egypt as known to the Jews, a complicated polytheism, embracing the worship of animals as well as the powers of nature, the belief in the transmigration of souls, and a sacerdotalism which carried ritualistic ceremonies to the greatest extent known to antiquity, combined with the exaltation of the priesthood to such a degree as to make priests the real rulers of the land, reminding us of the spiritual despotism of the Middle Ages. The priests of Egypt ruled by appealing to the fears of men, thus favoring a degrading superstition. How far they taught that the various objects of worship were symbols merely of a supreme power, which they themselves perhaps accepted in their esoteric schools, we do not know, but the priests believed in a future state of rewards and punishments, and thus recognized the soul to be of more importance than the material body, and made its welfare paramount over all other interests. This recognition doubtless contributed to elevate the morals of the people and to make them religious despite their false and degraded views of God and their disgusting superstitions. The Jews could not have lived in Egypt 400 years without being influenced by the popular belief. Hence, in the wilderness and in the days of kingly rule, the tendency to animal worship, in the shape of the golden calves, their love of ritualistic observances, and their easy submission to the rule of priests. In one very important thing, however, the Jews escaped a degrading superstition, that of the transmigration of souls, and it was perhaps the abhorrence by Moses of this belief that made him so remarkably silent as to a future state. It's seemingly ignored in the Old Testament. It is seemingly ignored in the Old Testament, and hence many have not. It is seemingly ignored in the Old Testament, and hence many have been led to suppose It is seemingly ignored in the Old Testament, and hence many have been led to suppose that the Jews did not believe in it. Certainly the most cultivated and aristocratic sect, the Sadducees, repudiated it altogether, while the Pharisees held to it. They, however, were products of a later age, and had learned many things, good and bad, from surrounding nations on their captivities, which Moses did not attempt to teach the simple souls that escaped from Egypt.